I don't know that humans have much utility beyond the moon, maybe Mars, but from a story perspective and from a
Yeah,
like trying to like get people excited about this, it just is not the same when a robotic lander touches down as opposed
yeah.
to human footprints and they're looking around in wonderment.
Are we signing up for a life in which the billionaires simply run the planet?
I think that's maybe one of the biggest question marks within this new age is that we really haven't seen people die in space.
This is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. We look each week at big invisible forces at work on us. And this week's theme has to do with a theme that we've been coming back to a lot, which is this idea that we're being asked to take a leap of faith by captains of industry when it comes to all these different areas of our lives. You know, whether it's our relationships with one another or what's, truly an original idea or whether or not we should believe the imagery that comes across the screen at us. Well, this week we're talking about space and the ways in which people who stand to make an extraordinary amount of money sending payloads and eventually human beings into space are pushing us to believe that it's totally normal to believe that we're going to not only leave this planet, but live perhaps on another one. And this week's guest is David Ariosto. He's the author of Open Space, a guide to the sort of geopolitical rivalries and profit motives that are pushing this race. He's also a visiting scholar at the Interplanetary Institute at Arizona State University. He's also the host of Space Minds, a podcast from Space News. Very smart, longtime journalist, former colleague of mine, someone I really like a lot. By the way, if you're watching the video here, you may be wondering what's going on with my hand. I fell off my bike yesterday, which has me thinking a lot about sort of the fragility of the human body, considering how easy it is to hurt yourself just falling a couple of feet onto concrete, much less being propelled into orbit on top of a thermonuclear weapon. Anyway, all of this we get into, who's going to be in charge? How are we going to get there? How dangerous is it? All of these things in this hour-long conversation with David Ariosto. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, I want to start with my biases. I think I've gotten to the place covering science and technology where I'm just a little too jaded, and I think I've gotten to a place where once upon a time I was all about, when I was the editor-in-chief of Popular Science, I was all about what science made possible, and space was a huge part of that. And now it's become this thing in which I think of, certainly in AI, which I spend so much time covering, there's so much faith-based talk about what's coming next, and
Yeah.
sign up for this amazing future, and we will reward you. And it's one thing to do that at the possible risk of losing your job and your ability to talk to people in bars. It's another thing to sign up to go to frickin' Mars, right?
Yeah.
And to sign up to get on a tube, built by some private corporation and go and try to, live on a planet that doesn't want you there. So help me think about how do you think about this? And do you're a cynical journalist like me, although I don't think you're quite as cynical as I am. And how do you
I'd be
think about,
surprised.
yeah, I bet, right? So tell me a little bit about how do you know what corporations are like, what the profit motive is like what's it like for you to look at space as a commercial enterprise
Yeah.
as it's become in our lifetime?
I think that's a really good place to start because when you go to factories, you attend sort of these board meetings, or you look at sort of these PowerPoint decks, you hear the sort of same pitch. It's like, we're going to Mars, lunar services economy. The nature of sort of the great unknown is being tapped into in unprecedented ways by virtue of reusable rocketry and nanotechnology and the intersection of AI and quantum that's making this sort of explosion of new
Right.
possibilities.
Already I'm like, I'm going to go get some coffee.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's right.
exactly. So you kind of go in these with sort of that understanding, right? I mean, a lot of the venture-backed capital that kind of pumps into these things are built on sort of dreams and hopes and the aspirations. And space in of itself, it embodies that. I think there's this sort of natural wonderment, so that sort of lends its well to the storytelling that naturally sort of ties into the commercial sector. And then when you marry it with the geopolitical confines, or the geopolitical impetus behind the current reality, which is very similar in many ways to what spawned the first space race. Important caveats in terms of the commercial sector not existing in the same way that it does now. But back then it was the Soviet Union. Now it's Beijing.
Mm,
And a lot of that is a driver, and there are some corollary effects. And so, you kind of wrap all this up, and it's hard not to kind of get wrapped up in the sense like we'll have settlements on the moon and settlements on Mars, and be taking, space tourisms and space hotels and journeys out to XYZ planet in terms of everything that's married with it. And then you add on top of that James Webb, which I do think has
Hmm.
added this new layer to this nature of the space landscape in terms it's almost like this new Copernican reckoning in the
Right.
sense
This is
of
so James Webb, just for anybody who doesn't know, the James Webb Space Telescope showing us incredible images of space that we haven't been able to see before,
yeah,
incredible optics, and has brought back incredible images from
something called a deep web
very far
field
away.
that's essentially showcasing the inception or the early formation of galaxies only maybe
Hmm.
200 million years after the formation of the universe itself 13.8 billion years ago. So like
Hmm.
all of this is sort of wrapped in this general sense of hope, and what could be, and more importantly investor dollars and commercial revenue. I do think that at a baseline level that is true when it comes to Earth's orbits. Because what
Hmm.
you're seeing there is you're seeing this sort of explosion of new satellite technologies. SpaceX itself has over 7,000 satellites in orbit. There's more than 10,000 up there, with plans for 42,000 in the coming years. So that is
Hmm.
a massive increase in terms of machinery that's up there. But then you look at the landscape in terms of hypersonics and the geopolitical threat that's surrounding there. You look at sort of maybe the terrestrial bottlenecks that are incumbent upon this sort of AI revolution that we see, and the power constraints. When you look terrestrially, there's power, there's water. I mean, you know this, Jake, better than anybody. That is a major suck in terms of both that life-giving water, especially in places like the desert, which
Hmm.
here in Arizona, Seaboard in Tucson basically voted down an expansion of an Amazon data center. So like there are real sort of NIMBY, questions of how this will all take shape. And space offers kind of an interesting solution to that in the sense
Hmm.
that it's both you can both take advantage of sort of the 24-hour power supply there. There's no day-night cycles if you're in sun synchronous orbit, but also if you can solve that conduction and convection question when it comes to operating the vacuum of space, and you can radiate some of this heat out there. It's 4 degrees Kelvin in space, and so those are natural heat sinks. So
Hmm.
there's an increasing market in terms of data centers in space. There's an increasing market in terms of pharmaceuticals because the nature of how cells develop, they mimic on sort of the scaffolding in ways that you can't mimic terrestrially. They sort of mimic how they actually grow in the human body. So cancer research, telecom, surveillance, detection, analytics, all of these things are tapping into, and I think this is the key, tapping into markets that already exist.
Hmm.
They're not creating new markets. The creation of new markets, like a lunar services economy, that's a question mark, I think. And
Hmm.
that can be a little bit pie in the sky, especially when you start extrapolating out further towards Mars. But I did have one of the interviews that I had with Lieutenant General John Shaw, formerly of Space Force. He said, if China is there, there will be an economy there. So,
Hmm.
the nature of how markets develop, whether or not they're organically derived or born of some sort of geopolitical impetus, I mean, that's a real question mark. But
Yeah.
I do think that there's some hype to pay attention to when it comes to the low Earth orbit, middle Earth orbit, and
Hmm.
geosynchronous.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, basically, there are all sorts of earthly businesses that can
Yes.
take advantage of what's of the properties of space and of being in space, even in low Earth orbit, that make those businesses here more successful. And that's why it makes sense for companies to be investing in this stuff. Whereas going and walking around Mars,
Yeah.
that may be totally a dream, and the payoff is not clear yet. But there is a business case closer to Earth, it
I
sounds
think
like.
I think what drove that sort of realization for me when I was looking at Toyota, which is not
Hmm.
a space company in terms of its traditional structures. And Toyota itself has developed its own sort of space arm because it sort of is looking to control sort of vertical supply chain, and it sees the nature of the power of orbital services, the analytics that can be derived from space, and doing some of the processing on orbit as opposed to sort of the bottlenecks that are created when you rely on ground stations, and the broader scalability and modularity of these different systems are increasingly becoming, I think, a business case, not only because of the nature of space itself, but because the technology has allowed it to be cost effective. So it
Hmm.
doesn't take as much to get into orbit. It used to be this is the purview of national governments. Um, now nonprofits and universities can kind of put their own CubeSats in orbit. So it's
Right.
like what that creates is sort of this diversity of options and sort of this own little ecosystem that's developing. And so when you're talking about orbital services or deorbiting, because some of these things are not meant to exist for 15 years, they're 5-year satellites that have to be taken down. Everything from in situ manufacturing to telecoms to pharmaceuticals. So there's a
Right.
lot that's happening up there that I think is just starting to become aware of.
So we're still, I mean, just to like make sure I understand, it's still, doesn't it still cost tens of millions of dollars to put a rocket into space? I hear about CubeSats, right? You can tag
Sure.
along, but
Hmm.
somebody's got to pay for that initial rocket, right? Isn't the
Yep.
cost still in the tens of millions of dollars?
If you're a launch provider, yes, yes.
Yeah. Right. Right.
If you're looking to glom onto a payload, you can do it at within SpaceX for a little over $2,000, depending on the
Literally
size of
just
the
like
payload.
it's like their UPS and you're paying for delivery.
Yeah. There's
Huh.
there's a button on Rocket Lab's website, which is a New Zealand base, is now I guess US based under Peter Beck, that has a red button, almost like Expedia, in the upper right hand corner, says book your launch. So it's not quite at the commercial airline type of
Right.
perspective, but it does suggest that things are growing. That being said, I mean the interesting thing about that is that one of the success stories, I think, in terms of the climate market, or the climate, perspective, one of the real is the closing of the ozone. And yet,
Mm,
when you look at how particulates in rocket launches collect in the upper atmosphere, they don't dissipate as easily. And so you have metallic particles that could undermine that if this starts to
mm,
kind of develop in a way that is more akin to that commercial airline services. Because I mean, you see all the fictional Hollywood accounts of hotels on Mars and new communities that are emerging on the lunar surface. I mean, you can throw a dart and hit one at a wall, but
hmm.
there are some downsides to this. And so
Right. Right.
how do you mitigate that? I mean, part of it is like more efficient and green fuel structures, but there's a spin on all of these things. So
Right.
how
I remember, so when I was at Popular Science, this was like one of our core topics, right? We would just spend a huge amount of time thinking about space travel just because our readership was so into it. And there were, and at that time, so I am dated in this stuff. And so you tell me if any of this has sort of improved. So at that
yeah
time, this was like 2012, 2011 maybe, they were talking a lot about how at that time, like you had to have permission to get into space. And once you were in space, at that time, there had been the first instance, I think, where two pieces of, like two satellites had banged into each other and then
yeah
cast off all this debris. And
yeah
whoever it is, NORAD or whoever it is that tracks what everything is up there, had to name every piece of debris and then track its vector. So
yeah
that and I just remember thinking like, oh, this is a problem. This sounds like there's way too much up there. And then at that time, there was also not enough. I don't think it was even required that you had to know how you were going to get that thing out of
yeah
orbit.
yeah
That you could put it up there. I mean, it was literally like a 1950s kind of like throw the beer can into the river kind of feeling, sort of
yeah
attitude about space. Ah, it's big enough. Don't worry about it. And
yeah.
now, right, has that changed? Do you now have to have a plan for deorbiting a thing that you put up there, or can anybody throw anything up there anytime?
It's a really important point. So a lot of what's governed up there is there are a number of interlocking treaties. One of which was devised in 1967, which is 2 years before the Apollo moon landing. So you can kind of get the nature of how, I don't want to say dated, but a lot has happened since then.
Right.
Um, there's been other treaties since then, and different sort of convening authorities. The Europeans have sort of taken a front and center role on this, and I think what you're referring to was a Chinese anti-satellite test, and there was also a collision of an aging satellite and an aging Russian satellite, a derelict satellite that had no power, so it couldn't maneuver, and a commercial satellite. And so
Hmm.
there's been a number of these instances over the years, and a number of near misses that has basically created this sort of incentive for people to kind of look at this more seriously and try to devise some sort of governing structure. And there is, and part of it has to do with some of those, interlocking treaties. But I think this to me is sort of the real crux of this new sort of space era, and that you have what seems to be a binary structure in terms of the pursuit of building infrastructure in space, exploratory technologies, one of which tends to be led, a Western and U.S. led effort, as part of these Artemis Accords, dozens and dozens of nations. And it's really, these are voluntary multilateral agreements that were meant to kind of establish rules and norms of how we operate up there. And then you have a Chinese-led version, which tends to have those like Russia, like Pakistan, a number of other countries that are looking sort of for alternatives to sort of a U.S. approach. And I
Hmm.
think the group that gets there first, when I say gets there, it's not like a sort of a touch the moon type of thing, flags and footprints like the Apollo era, but creates the kind of undeniable infrastructure that the rest of us are relying on. Because, a lot of this, our existing economy is actually run through orbit. Financial transactions, a lot of it's still fiber, but increasingly it's run through satellites. So, as we start to kind of tap into sort of the utility of orbital markets more, and as we sort of push off and look at resource development in other places, the group that is there in a bigger way gets to set the rules, so to
Hmm.
speak. And,
Hmm.
and the question then becomes, like what system do we want necessarily to live under? Is it more of a Western-based system, which tends to focus on the profit motives of individual companies that are federally subsidized through taxpayer, or is it truly a top-down approach, like what you see in Beijing, which
Hmm.
has a checkered record when it comes to human rights and surveillance and individual freedoms and all these things? I don't know that there's a utopia in terms of what comes next here, but
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't like either of these options. I don't
yeah,
like the sound of either of those. I have to
yeah,
say.
but
Is the
I
top-down approach that you're describing that China is talking about? Is this? I mean, once upon a time, that was the American approach, right? We were like you
very
said
much
at
so.
that time, right? Only nation states had the power to do this stuff, and so in
Yeah,
the era of Neil Armstrong, it was a military, and there was it was government money, and
yeah,
that had sort of military purposes as well as anything else, but not commercial purpose.
yeah.
So that's interesting. And is the idea that if this coalition of Russian, Chinese, Pakistani uh, space programs, get like you say, get there, why is it that they get to sort of is it just about like whoever is most advanced has gotten farthest out into space has a more whatever, I don't even know how to define success, right? Or the being there, right? But is out there in greater numbers. They is it because they would have sort of military control over space, and that's
Mm.
why we have to compete with them, or like why do we care what they're up to if space is as huge as it is?
I would relate this in two ways. So the first way is kind of like the TikTok approach, right? In
Hmm.
terms of the ubiquity of the landscape, like you just put something out there that tends to be very popular or sort of foundational to kind of like the highway system of this sort of next frontier. And whether or not you want to, you just end up gravitating towards it because it's
Hmm.
sort of just the dominant player in the landscape.
Hmm.
In that vein, there's all kinds of sort of back end questions that start to emerge in terms of broader data privacy and surveillance and the nature of how these things are kind of even influencing in political systems. I think those are like real questions in terms of the infrastructure that we're building and how it will sort of translate into this economy of the future. Who controls the infrastructure matters when it comes
Hmm.
to these things. The other side of this, and I'll say, is that there's something really interesting about pursuing technologies and pursuing science for science sake that has these inevitable downstream effects that don't necessarily always have markets that are attached to them, but will later on. I mean, if you look at the Apollo program, the emergence of things like CAT scans and other technologies that we never thought of. And that was actually to kind of like identify air gaps within the spun aluminum of the Apollo crafts. And, someone effectively said, oh, well, maybe we can use this for medical imaging. And, a whole industry was born out of that. So,
Hmm.
you don't know, right? And I wonder actually long term what that portends when looks the US is very good at sort of quarterly innovation, as I call it, or looking at things with a clear business case. I mean, you can
Sure.
kind of walk into an investor meeting and say, this is a market need, this is how I fill it, let's marry the two, and let's just go.
Hmm.
When it comes to sort of those long lead topics that take, like the CERN like projects that
Right.
take 10,
Foundational
15 years,
science.
right?
Yeah.
Foundational science and the magnetic effect that has for the world scientific community to sort of draw the world scientists into places and do science for science sake without the pressures of having to make it commercially viable now, but someone will find a commercial viability for it later on, how that ripples in terms of the geostrategic advantages of a nation state relative to the rest of the world, I think is something you really have to pay attention to. I mean, one of the conversations I had with somebody actually within the Chinese space sector told me that, like, we used to worry about our scientists like going to the U.S. and staying at Stanford and MIT and Caltech. They're coming back now, and
Hmm.
part of that has to do with sort of the immigration policies. Part of that has to do with just like the nature of the interesting things the Chinese are doing. The Chinese landed on the far side of the moon and
Hmm.
collecting lunar regolith and picking up helium-3, which is this non-radioactive isotope that essentially serves potentially two functions. One, it's kind of an ideal fusion fuel source, which is, as you know, just starting to come online. But more importantly, it's a really, really good coolant for
Hmm.
quantum technologies. And you can't get this stuff terrestrially on Earth because it's deposited by solar winds, which, within the Earth's atmosphere are shielded. So it's sort of why you
Hmm.
see the northern lights, like, because it's a reflective effect that goes screaming towards the poles. Well, on the moon, there's virtually no atmosphere, and so this stuff just collects on the lunar surface. So there are viable reasons to go there from a resource extraction perspective. If you say helium-3 to some people in the scientific community, they'll be like, yeah, it's there, but like how you get it back and make it commercially viable, does it make good business sense to kind of
Hmm.
go there and bring it back, and will it still be viable within the market space? Most, I'd say 99% of the resources on lunar surface, the answer is no. But
Hmm.
helium-3 is a question because it's
Hmm.
so rare and it's so good in both those capacities.
When we come back, we're going to talk about this question of whether or not it's worth going there, and specifically whether or not humans should be going there or if it should be an all robot crew. We'll be right back. I've had the honor of going to a couple of different. I've taken some trips to NASA facilities. I got to go to the Johnson Space Center once, and I've been to JPL on the West Coast a few times, the Jet Propulsion
Oh,
Laboratory,
those
and
places are so cool.
so
Just,
cool, so
yeah,
cool. But what's so interesting, right, is so Johnson Space Center is full of, it's got like actual rockets like on their side. You can walk around in the heat, and see what it's like. Um, and and the whole vibe of Johnson Space Center is putting humans right into space.
yeah,
It's the putting the bravest men and women in the world to into orbit. Whereas when you speak to the Jet Propulsion Lab people, at least quietly, not on camera, they say, "Why would you ever put a human being into space?" Like
yeah,
the whole purpose for JPL, and they built like the Mars rover, which the incredible Mars lander project, and all this stuff. They put automated things on other planets because their argument is, and this was the argument back during the Apollo missions too, why would you put humans up there? That we are so fragile. We can
yeah,
barely survive a car crash. Like, we barely can stay alive for our full life term on our own planet, much less out there.
yeah.
Give us a sense, like dial it back a little bit, just into the. I'd love to just hear your perspective on like give us some sense like what is it like for a human being to go into space? How dangerous is it for a human being to go into space? And then how do you think about this? Should we as humans even be up there at all, or should we be sending waves and waves and waves of robots in our place?
Well, first, it's wildly dangerous. I mean, it's just one of the more dangerous things that you can do. I mean, there was a recent study that came out in terms of just the radiation exposure. It's like if we were to someday send
Hmm.
astronauts to Mars, radiation exposure when it comes to just getting there, which is between 6 and 9 months, and then establishing some sort of human settlement. I mean, you got 4 years before for that you'll be succumb to that. Now, there's different
Because
ways to kind of
you're not protected by an atmosphere, right? Our atmosphere protects us from a certain amount of solar radiation, but when I mean, even I remember reading once that like every airline flight you take
yeah.
is exposing you to way more radiation than you were getting on the ground.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just the nature of getting further from the surface of the earth, right?
Yeah, that you magnify that by 10x or 100x or 1000x when you're in deep space. And there are different technologies that you can come across to kind of mitigate some of those effects. Actually, like tanks of water are actually somewhat effective in sort of blunting the effects of that. But there's different concerns of secondary radiation, how sort of like cosmic rays are sort of that will bounce around the hull of the ship. And when you look at like the nature of how to overcome that, there are volcanic structures in the moon, in terms of sort of
Hmm.
the magma activity, and the same thing within Mars, that could provide some natural shielding. The idea of like returning to caves the way we did as their inception
Listen,
is
man,
is
I didn't fly 9 months to go live underground. That's right.
yeah. I mean,
Exactly.
I was speaking in Vegas recently, and I just thought to myself, like, I can't see any daylight outside. It just
Right.
this all
Casino
feels
life. Yeah,
just
you're
I
flying all that
lose my
way for casino
mind.
life.
I lose my mind, and I mean the psychological aspects of this are not to be discounted in terms of like
Right.
the frailties of this. Forget the biology of this, just the fact that like you're marooned millions of miles away from Earth. Oftentimes, these things are sort of billed as one-way trips in terms of how you structure a colony. And what does
Right.
that look like? And what kind of
Right. For every
oversight do you have?
for every Buzz Aldrin who says, "Oh, I'd be happy to go take a one-way trip to Mars," or Elon Musk
Yeah,
seems to feel that same way, that is not how I feel
yeah,
about it. No, I get homesick, just flying around here on Earth. Like I can't
yeah,
even imagine what that
yeah.
is like. I remember
But
also, I
you
mean,
said,
you mentioned the psychological thing, and I just think that's worth talking about too, right?
yeah,
I don't think people understand that, like, yeah, 6 to 9 months, and it's not 6 to 9 months, walking around in a field
no,
and jumping in a swimming pool. 6 to 9 months in a tube with like other people,
yeah,
smelling their farts for 9 months. I mean, you start to fall apart. I remember there was I interviewed some people, this is years ago, but there was a NASA study about what it would be like to coop everybody up inside
yeah.
a tube for that amount of time, and it inevitably went terribly wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Like people punching each other in the nose
I
and
was here in
sexual
Arizona,
harassment.
actually.
Is that
Yeah,
right? Was that right? Yeah.
yeah,
What
yeah.
anything you want to tell us about that? I remember thinking like, oh, right, we're not good at parties, not
Yeah.
9 month parties anyway.
With this is I think speaks to your broader question because there's a siloed effect. I think, and this is sort of
Mm,
the importance of sort of connecting the dots in the nature of this, because when you ask engineers, they'll have one explanation in terms of what's technically feasible. And you ask sociologists, and it's a bit different question. And just
right.
like it's just there's such a diversity of layers to the human experience and what's possible, that to kind of encapsulate just within one discipline. That being said, I think it's interesting. Like I spent some time at the Mars Desert Research Station up in Utah, which is this sort of like analog Martian habitat. And so you go there,
Mm,
and people are sort of dressed in this way, and you have a hab, and you have these bunkers, and different rovers that kind of go out in this iron oxidized landscape that, I mean, by all intents and purposes, it looks kind of like Mars. But I mean, they're handing out bars made of crickets that
mm,
you're
right.
eating right now. Crickets, I mean, generally bugs are pretty high in protein, so that's low mass, high protein. That's kind of what you want on a Martian trip. You want to do 4 years of cricket bars?
That's
I'm
not
not
what I
sure.
want. Yeah, I was going to say
Yeah,
that's not what I want, David. No, thank
I,
you.
I will say that the Italian crew that was aboard did smuggle in some bottles of olive oil and made some fettuccine
Yeah, I
alfredo
mean,
when we were there.
exactly.
Yeah,
Jesus, I mean, if we, from the COVID experience alone, we know, right? Like
yeah,
my first thing was to like start, like buying expensive milk and stuff. I was like, by God,
yeah,
I'm going to enjoy something around here.
yeah,
That's exactly right. They're going to need to figure out some really nice chocolates they can
yeah.
send with us
But
for
but
those
you
nine
asked a
months.
question about humans versus robotics. I kind of want to
Yeah,
delve into that a little bit, in the sense
yeah.
that if you take it at face value, right? Like robotics are naturally far more capable than humans. So, from a pure engineering standpoint, it seems pretty clear. I mean, a human can do a heck of a lot more on the lunar surface or the Martian surface than a robot, but that will change over time in terms of just technological advancements. I think the more important question when it comes to that, or it's more important sort of subset of that question, is that the commercial space industry does not really exist without taxpayer dollars at the moment,
Mm,
right? And
okay,
so
right, right.
even SpaceX would barely survive. Well, they would, but they barely survive if they didn't have these massive federal contracts.
Mm,
That's changing with the pharmaceutical and the telecoms and the neighbor orbital services and surveillance and all these other things. But generally speaking, these are things that are subject to political whims. Now, historically, in order to kind of get buy-in for these things, you need narratives, right? And so Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, even Yuri Gagarin are billed as sort of the national hero within the Soviet Union.
right.
And so there are these like, like cue the John Williams music when you talk about space, right? There's like this whole PR thing in the background that's happening that drives this very like human heroic
Yes. Right.
standard, like
Right.
the nature of the hero, so to speak, is an interesting one when we're talking about space. I mean, even Michael Collins said, don't call us heroes. We were just doing our jobs up
Yeah.
there,
Right. Right. Right.
This is not like something worthy of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, other people will disagree with that, but
Right.
you know, when you think about that in terms of like the galvanizing influence of what a hero or what like this significance of putting human boots on the ground, and first woman in space or first person of color to set foot on the moon. Um, these are touchstones that could have ripple effects in terms of both the political currency that you derive from it and like the impetus to kind of continue these taxpayer funded programs,
Right.
but it also has like a broader galvanizing effect in terms of like the secondary effects of the industry itself. So from a pure practical perspective, I don't know that humans have much utility beyond the moon, maybe Mars, but that's really it. I would think
Right.
just the nature of these
Right.
things. But from a story perspective and from a
Yeah.
like trying to like get people excited about this, it just is not the same when a robotic lander touches down as opposed
Yeah.
to human footprints and they're looking around in wonderment. So like
That's
there's a
really
soft
interesting. Right.
science to this as well as a hard science.
Yeah. So Michael Collins, who you mentioned, the third man on the first moon landing mission, who
Hmm.
the guy who had to stay up behind
Yeah.
while Aldrin and Armstrong went on the moon. He's my favorite character in that whole saga.
Yeah.
My favorite astronaut was Alan Bean, who was he was the one who would talk most openly about how terrifying the whole thing was. I
Yeah.
liked him a great deal, but Collins is so cool, and there's a great documentary for anybody who hasn't seen it called "In the Shadow of the Moon," which is this great sort of set of interviews with these guys. And Collins said at one point that when they would go around in the speech, giving speeches sort of around the world afterwards, people would come up to them and say, "We did it." People who were not Americans would say, "We did it.
Yeah.
We got there." And to your point, like there's something that captures the human imagination in just seeing another Homo sapien out
Oh
in the
yeah.
world. Now, I agree with you that I think the fact that the whatever it is, 24 people who've ever set foot on the moon were entirely white men, all of them, that's a bummer. And so we're going to need to put some other people up there to get that same effect, I think, these days. But yeah, that seemed to have a universal appeal, at least at that time.
Yeah, I interviewed this guy named Doug Terrier, who's a sort of chief technology officer, former chief technologist at NASA, now at the Johnson Space Center, and he was living in Jamaica at the time, and his teacher, Mrs. Simpson, was reading out the Reuters feeds of the of
Mm,
en route to the moon. She basically just stopped teaching that week and was just reading these things, and the guy was so transfixed by this that he
mm,
went to the States as an adult, got his PhD at like 16 or one of these types, and ended up working at NASA. I mean, same thing with Cam Ghaffarian. Cam Ghaffarian was Iranian-born, uh, future NASA contractor, who he was standing in his like on top of his roof in Isfahan, and that's kind of like what people, if anybody's spending time in the Middle East, a lot of people sleep on the roofs just as it gets cooler out there. But if you're there and you're like higher elevation in the desert, low humidity, kind of the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, and you're getting to see as you go to sleep just this like tapestry of stars
mm,
there. And then in 1969, in the summer, he climbed down and was at his neighbor's house, and he's watching like these grainy black and white images of Neil Armstrong taking those first steps. Fast forward, I mean, this like catapulted him into a career in NASA, and now he's overseeing Axiom Space and Intuitive
mm.
Machines, first company to put a commercial lunar lander on the South Pole, and developing commercial spacesuits. So it's like, I guess my point is it's hard. You can't discount like what happens in early childhood and the sort of like the indelible effects that has and the ripple effects
Yeah,
of seeing like, maybe I could be an astronaut too. And it might not happen for everybody, but they might be doing other things, and not even
right.
necessarily in space, but just like STEM in general.
Yeah,
So,
that's it's funny the way I process it, how amazing these people are, is the contrast between how they are and how I would be if I
yeah,
were up there. And I remember interviewing, I can't remember his name, but I interviewed an astronaut who had started out as a test pilot, which is such a typical path for a lot of these guys.
yeah.
And
A lot of
these
military heritage in NASA.
yeah, right.
That's
And test pilot, like those are crazy people. Like they are truly
yeah,
there to risk death every day to see if this like
just
half-built
ice in the
plane is going to
veins
work.
type
Yeah,
of
ice in the veins.
individuals. Yeah,
So this guy, I basically asked him, I was like, how do you not just freak the fuck out when you're strapped to the front of this rocket?
yeah,
You're on a bomb and you're about to be launched upright into space. Like I can't even climb a ladder without getting
yeah,
vertigo. How do you not just panic and claw at the windows? And he said, well, He's like, we got this. He said, we were taught in test pilot school, we had this thing called winding the clock. And I was like, what's that?
Mm.
And he's like, well, one time I was flying a plane and my job was to shoot down this drone. And when I fired the missile, it didn't come off the wing. It remained on the wing
Oh
armed,
God.
but was not, it would not go. And so suddenly I have a live warhead on attached to me and I'm flying over the like Antelope Valley. And he was like, and we're taught at that point to reach up to where they have duct tape. The ground crew has duct taped this cheap Taiwanese clock to the dash. And then you reach up and you wind it is your thing. It's one of these ones where you gotta wind it in order to keep it going. He said, and you do that to occupy the front of your brain so you don't panic, so you can
Oh
think.
wow.
And he's like, so I'm thinking as I'm winding this clock, oh, should I dump it over the ocean or should I fly over LA? Like, what am I going to do? And he's like, no, I think I can land it. And he landed the plane and was fine. And I just remember just being like, whoa, dude, that is not what I would do. I would hit eject immediately, right? Scratch the $50
Yeah.
million plane, whatever it is. And then the other one was I got to interview Franklin Chang Diaz, who was one of the,
Mm.
he's a Costa Rican born astronaut who was, his career was bookmarked by the Challenger and Columbia disasters. He was supposed to
Mhm.
be on both of those and got scrubbed off them and managed to
Wow.
survive as a result. He's like the luckiest of the astronauts. And all the people he had trained with died.
Yeah.
But so that alone, I was just like, dude, I'd be out of there in a second. But he's, his dream to go to space. He went to space. He said he was up there doing a moonwalk or a spacewalk. He had something where he's moving something from one place to another place. And he looks down and he sees the clouds part. And there is Costa Rica, his homeland, perfectly showing in just on this glowing planet beneath him. And he said that at that moment, he had a momentary thought, wow, if I took a photograph of that right now, it would be like on every school wall in Costa Rica. I'm the
Yeah.
only person of my background who will ever have this view of my planet. I should take this photograph right now. But he had this like, huge piece of equipment in his hands and he would have to drop it to grab the camera. And instead
Right.
he's like, but I'm going to finish the mission instead. And so he moved his instrument across, the clouds closed,
Yeah.
and that was it. And I said to him at the time, I was like, man, I would have thrown that instrument
Scrap the
and
mission, get the photo.
yes, just get the phone out immediately. And that's why you don't hire guys like me to do this. And I
Well, but
think,
you do hire
and this
guys
is,
like you in terms of journalism.
well, I
That's
guess so, I guess so. But I mean, this is
yeah.
the thing though, is right. It takes the only humans we've seen go up there have been such superhumans, except for Katy Perry and her and that flight, right? They're all superhumans so far,
Yeah.
and so I don't know that it's clear what everyday people will be like when if we try and send them to the moon or beyond.
It's a real question. I don't know.
Yeah,
We get back to
yeah,
the psychological issues of all of these things. Those
yeah.
are not to be discounted. Although
No,
the other side of it are kind of like the overview effect that astronauts will often describe in terms of not seeing borders and sort of like the fragility of the planet itself. And
hmm,
Carl Sagan's sort of pale blue dot. When you look at that and that beam of light that just like where Voyager turned around from the depths of Neptune and like cast that lens back at Earth, and you
right.
just see this speck of where we all live, just in the sea of blackness. And you
Hmm,
realize like this is the spaceship that we all live on that's just like careening through space at incredible speeds as it like meanders around the galaxy. And the nature of the environmental movement, it has part of its roots in that sense of an overview effect. And
right.
even broader political concerns seem somewhat like minuscule when you kind of see it in that context.
I like
So
that
like
idea. I like the
all
idea that we're gonna like drag everybody into space once, and
yeah.
it erases their racism and sexism and the rest of it, and then bring them back for a better life on Earth. I like that a lot.
It's just remarkable. You think about like how the differences that we have are so minuscule, but and when
Hmm.
you actually drill down to it, and sometimes it just kind of takes a little bit of a step back to kind of see that. We gotta get mired in our own in our own filter bubbles in our own communities, and what's important. And I'm not saying any of this stuff is not important, but it's just when taken in the broader context of space, the politics, the environmental concerns, like all these things they just become different, I think.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
maybe we'd stand to gain by having a few more astronauts,
Right, right,
running
right.
for office.
When we come back, we're going to talk about the money, how the billionaires have taken control of at least the private side of this industry. Stay with us. Elon Musk, right? I can't help but come to you about Elon Musk and the sort of billionaire culture that
Mhm.
is sort of endemic now to private space travel. Now, I remember going years ago to a presentation on mining asteroids, what it would take to land on and mine asteroids. And it was, you mentioned earlier in the conversation, the American ability to articulate value quarter by quarter, and
Yeah.
this, conversation that these guys wanted to have about, if we went and got, we could bring back, an amount of these precious elements that are finite on Earth but are basically infinite in space, and blah 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 blah. And I remember thinking, wow, that's kind of a crazy reason to go up there. And
Yeah.
then to see now the sort of the to see a Jeff Bezos or a Elon Musk get involved in this stuff, not just for money, but because they seem to be, I mean, it may be, but they seem to be transfigured by the idea that we really need to somehow grow beyond this planet, and that
Yeah.
they're the guys to help lead that way. I mean, for you, I look at that and I'm like, these guys are supposed to be numbers guys, and they can't even do the math on how likely they are to die on the way to Mars, much
Yeah.
less, think rationally about the whole enterprise. Um, you know, Tell me how you think about this. Like, what is it like to have the locus of power shift from, you know, NASA, which has basically now been relegated to being kind of a client, to
hmm
somebody like Musk, who is sort of a, priest of the need to go beyond our
Yeah. I mean,
planet.
there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, NASA itself is sort of like, in some ways, just by virtue of sort of the political machinations and the sort of the changing nature of the industry, kind of adopted more of a client-based approach as
Yeah.
opposed to the architect of America's space program. Now you see NASA payloads on Falcon 9 rockets, and it's just a very different relationship. They still serve as strategic advisors, and you actually do see a lot of NASA people working in these places. So, if you go through the ranks of SpaceX, a lot of them are coming from, JPL and the Johnson Space Center and others. So there's like still a lot of sort of NASA DNA in the commercial sector. But it's interesting, right? Because I think when you speak to engineers, right? I spoke to this guy down in Houston named Rob Moorhead, who really just like rocket whisperer type of guy, and he had worked on a program called Project Morpheus. And Project Morpheus was with a methalox fuel system. Methalox is basically methane with liquid oxygen as the sort of the oxidizer. And they wanted to use methane not because it was, it actually had a higher ignition than some of the other conventional fuels. So it doesn't, like, if you think about you're trying to lighting your stove, like methane just doesn't light as easily as some of
Mm.
these other traditional fuels. But methane's found in vast quantities on Mars. And you can create methane called by virtue of something called the Sabatier reaction, which is like a 19th century chemistry reaction in terms of how we create fuel and different energy. But I guess the point is that he wanted to do this. There wasn't a lot of running room at NASA to do this, and he just
Mm.
kind of scrapped it. And he was quietly building like the beginnings of a Methalox rocket engine in his garage because he was just so like enamored with this concept about sort of homegrown fuel sources in the cosmos, um, that he got caught the eye of some folks that he used to work with at NASA who were working at Intuitive Machines, who, oh, by the way, put the first lunar lander on the moon, and guess what that was powered by? Well,
Mm.
Methalox. And it
Mm.
was Rob's sort of design that made this happen. So on the one side, I think there was this yearning by a lot of people at NASA that saw sort of the intractability of some of these cost plus contracts and the legacy giants of Boeing and Lockheed taking decades to kind of complete projects, and the political capital that was expended, and like this hope that in the wake of the Apollo program that, like, we're, I mean, you listen to the commentary in the 1960s, and it's just like we're doing the moon first, then we're going to land an astronaut, then we're going to Mars, and then we're
Right.
like we're going to spread out across and human species is going to be this
Right.
multi-planetary
Honeymoons in
entity.
orbit. Here we
That's
go.
right.
That's right.
Right, and none of it happened. Like we
Mm.
basically touched the moon, 1972, the last Apollo mission. That was like, that's it. Um, The
Yeah.
Soviets actually went some other places. Soviets landed on Venus. How many people know that
I didn't know
in the
that. Is that right?
U.S.? Soviets landed. Yeah, they had an air program that essentially they were robotic landers. Um, the Venusian atmosphere is so thick that you actually don't even need parachutes to get through it. It's just some like this soupy quality, and
Whoa.
it's 900 degrees Fahrenheit. So this thing barely, could survive, but it survived long enough to take photos from the 1970s
Wow, I
from the,
didn't know
the, the
that.
surface of Venus. Nobody knows this stuff in the
Yeah,
United States.
right,
So like
right.
you get a sense of how like these things are wrapped in their own sort of national narratives. But I mean, it's interesting. But then you throw in the flip side, right? And I do get the sense that, some of the titans of industry that have emerged, they're selling a dream in many ways, right?
Mm,
The VC community it looks at what Elon has done with Tesla and in SpaceX Starlink, which has been a pretty successful
yeah,
constellation
sure.
program. So they're like, we're going to take a chance on this guy. But from a dollars and cents perspective, and just like the pure dangers, like how many people will die if you send them to Mars? I mean, this is
That's
this
right.
is not a, and I think that's maybe one of the biggest question marks within this new age is that we really haven't seen people die in space. Um, so a test pilot, one test pilot, that's it. But nobody
Right.
in the commercial era has died, and that was not the case in the first space race. Apollo
No,
1, the fire, and
that's right. That's right. But and at
various
that time,
Soviet astronauts.
and we were just, blissfully unaware of how awful those deaths were because they weren't being
Yes.
like live streamed the way it would be today. I mean, to
Yeah.
my mind, the Apollo 13 disaster, but then they save themselves and they all somehow come home alive
Yeah.
is such an incredible fluke compared to
Oh, those
how
guys had
like
a 10% chance of living.
oh man, I mean
It's extraordinary.
it should have been the dark one of the darkest things ever. I mean,
Yeah.
that could have been a really grisly thing. And
Yeah.
now, I think, yeah, about the like, every single moment of every single test launch is streamed from 50 angles.
Yeah.
Yeah, like when somebody dies in this effort, it's going to
So
be
what happens then? Like, is
yeah,
it the
right.
political capital? Does that start to evaporate in terms of the real federal contracts that are behind
Yeah.
SpaceX and Blue Origin and United Launch Alliance and all these other things? I
Yeah.
don't think so because it's our defense sector has become so reliant upon these things and the
Hmm.
nature of warfare. Just, I mean, these things, we're having space wars now, and what we saw with Ukraine and Russia, I mean, that was in many ways the first space war in
Hmm.
essence, because I mean, Starlink played a major role in terms of situational awareness and even Russia's ability to sort of retarget through triangulation and just
Wow.
the nature of battlefield comms is like it can't be discounted. Like the
Hmm.
fog of war, as what we all talk about. I mean, space is large, but so is Earth, and so to be able to coordinate, troops at key strategic moments is everything.
Yeah.
Um,
I didn't understand how incredibly powerful the surveillance apparatus was that people were building for space until I was talking to a NASA administrator. I can't remember who it was, and he was describing to me getting a phone call, basically from the NSA,
yeah.
saying, "Hey, we've got an extra satellite we don't need, and we thought you could maybe make use of it." And and he was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And they were like, "It's basically like, what's the one before Webb?
Oh, Hubble.
yeah, it's like Hubble, but we aim it at the Earth, and all
Yeah.
you would have to do is flip it around and change the optics a little bit, and
Yeah.
you can have it to do it." That was the first time I realized, this guy was saying to me, it's like, yeah, they have a lot of money they spend on a whole other space program that you never get to hear about
Oh,
because
and it's
that's the
just in the
nature of it.
technology that are coming online, like gravity interferometers and quantum sensors, and just the nature of like picking apart gravitational variations in the densities of rocks and materials to know from space, what the composition is under XYZ country in terms of like, oh, is there oil there? Is there gold? Is there iron ore? Questions about like the nature of stealth technology in terms of self subs. I mean, if you're displacing gravity at different variations, that's beyond the scope of our stealth technology. And so like to be able to pinpoint the nature of who we are at 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 a centimeter's level from thousands of miles overhead, and how that blends into sort of digital twin technologies and mapping and gaming of like predictive scenarios in terms of wargaming or commercial enterprise, or Walmart monitoring the traffic patterns of its consumers right around the holiday season. Like, our understanding of humanity is growing so precise and so predictive
Hmm.
that, if you look at the positive spin on that, it's like, okay, well, we can use this toward, really identifying and ameliorating, wildfires in the Brazilian Amazon, or,
Sure.
logging efforts. And like, if you see access roads that are starting to make their way into Patagonia, or, the Brazilian rainforest, you can assume that, okay, well, if there's logging roads, then deforestation will happen and you can alert authorities. So that's
Hmm.
the positive spin.
Right.
The negative spin is privacy questions, and the nature of social engineering, and the, precision of our defense musicians, and, which also, I mean, maybe that's better than some, like, these quote unquote dumb bombs that were dropped over Dresden during the firebombing in World War II, and so, the vast human casualties that were there.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
God, it's just, I mean, it's so pronounced and scary in some ways, but it's,
Yeah.
we're kind of entering this sort of brave new world.
When we come back, we're going to talk about the brave new world of actually living up there. If we were to do that, who the hell would be in charge? We'll look at that. Stay with us. Let's say we get there, and let's say that, you know, Musk is in charge, right? He got us there. He built the stuff, and so we're living in his hotels.
Yeah. X Town on Mars. Yeah.
Yeah, X Town,
Yeah.
right? Are we
Yeah.
living under him? Like, how are we signing up for a life in which the billionaires simply run the planet? Or is there going to be some other? You have a chapter in Open Space called
Hmm.
Governing Mars. Tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about that. Like, what will life in theory be like if we somehow survive the 6 to 9 month trip, and we're not all driven crazy by each other, and we get there and we're walking around and setting up shop? What do we think life might look like? Who's in charge up there?
There's different schools of thought on this. If you ask Robert Zubrin in the Mars Society, basically he'll look at this as like, so the ultimate in competing societies, and that the cream sort of rises to the top. So if you have Chinese settlements and U.S. settlements and European settlements, and some are more corporate driven than others, and some are more state driven than others, like the nature of the talent pool gravitate towards the most attractive place. And, sort of
Oh,
it will, we'll talk about, the magnetism of spaceborne and cosmic immigrants in
so
a way.
whoever's airlock is being knocked at the most, that settlement, just their customs
That
naturally
will be a
take over.
flourishing arena, and, also
Whoa.
has to do with sort of like the efficacy of the engineering, and, I mean,
Right.
really, when you're developing these things, the old adage is like, the cross section of people that you need is an engineer, an engineer, an engineer, and an engineer.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
so
right.
that doesn't hold true in terms of like the long term survivability of the colony or the settlement. But
Right.
I tend to take a little bit more of a retrospective perspective when I look at that. you know, Back in the 1600s, in terms of this country, there was the Jamestown colony was established by something called Virginia Company, which was a English sponsored company. So this wasn't a purely state run effort, but basically the British Crown, the English Crown, said, we'll fund, or we'll subsidize this commercial endeavor for a couple reasons. One, we do want some strategic advantage in terms of like the growth of, the Spanish and the French empires. And so we need competition, and we need our sense of, our sense of placement in this emerging arena of where ships are bringing back gold, and, the development of tobacco fields and all these things. So, this is our beachhead. Um, and the financiers in England saw like a real possibility for making real money. And then you have the people who went, and maybe they were going for different reasons, the sort of intrepid pioneers. But what happened was, you have a colony that has all these competing interests in terms of why it's there, right? The individuals that are actually building it, maybe they have concerns about like the safety of the colony in terms of other groups that are there that might attack them. Whereas the financiers back in London are saying, well, yeah, but when are the ships coming? When are you bringing back the resources?
Hmm.
And so you have these competing these competing rationales for what develops there, and it's hardly democratic.
Hmm.
It's this is where like the beginnings of indentured servitude start to take hold. This notion of like selling yourself into sort of this bonded work situation, of which
Yeah.
you can't really get out of. And I guess you can kind of slip into the countryside. In Mars, you really can't get out of it. Once you're
Right.
there, you're there.
You're breathing
And
company air, or you're
it's
not breathing
company
air at
air. I mean,
all. Hmm.
everything is sort of oriented towards a system that's based on sort of a corporate structure, not
Hmm.
necessarily a democratic one. Now, that doesn't mean to say that any company that's operating in space is not bound by the rules and regulations as dictated by the home country. In SpaceX case, it would be the United States that so like ultimately has governing authority. But in practice, when you're that far away,
Yeah.
and oversight is, I mean, I don't know what kind of oversight you're going to have in terms of this. The nature of, I don't know, is it a Lord of the Flies type of
Right.
existence that sort of develops, or is it like Robert Zubrin to remake the world over again, as Thomas Paine once described? And it's they're great unknowns, but I think in some ways there's no good options.
Yeah, I
it,
mean,
it
that's kind of
sounds
the thing I was thinking about. Like,
yeah
I mean, again, I can't stop, but I can't stop thinking about the sort of the cynical minutia of it. Yeah, like labor violations. They make you work every weekend, and the U.S. Labor Department says you got to shape up,
yeah.
or we're going to, send an emissary to be upset at you, and he'll get there in 9 months and give you
Yeah,
some
and
papers.
but when that emissary gets there, that emissary is relying on the
Yeah,
food, water,
yeah,
and air
yeah,
that is
exactly.
provided by the company. So,
You got to
oh
keep
yeah,
him alive so he can
everything's fine
punish
here.
you. Totally. No, and then
So
I also think about, that the arrival in the United States of the Plymouth colony, the establishment of that. I mean, never putting aside for a moment the you know, genocidal uh, effects on people who are already living there, right? Because
yeah,
that won't be the case on Mars. But
yeah,
the impulses might be similar in that they might say, we want to have our own culture and our own customs. Screw
yeah,
you, Earth. We're going to do our own thing and break free of the whole thing. I mean, this is the basis of a lot of good science fiction, right? Is that people
yeah,
break free and say, no, we're not going to abide by the rules of the home planet.
yeah.
That's right. That's
There's
right.
also another aspect to this that I find interesting, and this is like kind of science fictiony in a way. But if you think about a population that's growing in Mars and existing for generations upon generations, well, on the one hand, yes, I think we're all starting to see a little bit of a meld with technology in a way, in increasing ways. So that will kind of maybe address certain concerns. But you have to think over hundreds, thousands of years, if the human species is fortunate enough to survive that long, that will start to fundamentally be different subsets
Hmm.
in terms of like the radiation exposure that you would be subject to on Mars and all the various or environmental differences between the two. And what does that look like if humanity is actually meant to push out into distant components and different lands and terrestrial bodies? Do we fundamentally start to depart and create sort of subsets of each other? I don't know
Hmm.
what the answer to that question is, and it's one that can really be only born over millennia of time because evolution is what Darwin said, marked by the long lapse of the ages.
Yeah.
But in any case, it's an interesting kind of quandary when you think about space, not necessarily the next 10 years, 15 years, 100 years, but really, I mean, human species has been around for, arguably around 20,000 years. We've seen a lot of different variations over the course of that. And Homo sapiens have kind of lived without relative or rival for much of that time. Who knows? Who knows what
Yeah.
sort of this next iteration might be, particularly when you talk about sort of the meld with some of these technologies that are coming online.
Yeah.
And when you look at Neuralink, when you look at some of these other sort of bio hacks that kind of are becoming more and more part of our sort of our day to day,
Hmm.
I
I feel like
wonder,
my
like
one of
I
the
wonder
guiding
what will
questions
look
that I was
like,
taught early
long term.
on in my career by a guy, Kevin Kelly, who worked at Wired when I was an intern there. He used to say, "What is the technology trying to tell us about ourselves?"
Yeah,
And that is a what you are asking is very much that question. So before I let you go in our last few moments here, I would love to hear just like what for you has been a kind of like source of wonder for you has been a kind of like source of one. So the Kepler program, which was looking at whether or not, for anybody who doesn't know, it was looking out at planets that might be habitable, and it
Mm,
would measure the relationship, the distance between the planet and its sun, and then also the ratio of that distance to how big the planet is, and then would figure out, oh, this is an Earth-like planet. And
yeah,
when they discovered the one that was closest to us, they were like, it's right down the block, like it's right there. It's Proxima Centauri B.
yeah,
And it's right there. And people were doing all kinds of stuff about like, here's what it might look like, and here's what life might be like on it. And you could like, in theory, breathe the air in this place.
mm,
And then they were talking about 4.2 light years. That's how close it is. It's just 4.2 light years away. And
right,
then I remember when I did the math on it, and I actually kick off my book, The Loop, with this story because it just is so mind blowing. 4.2 light years away means that at the current rates of travel of speed that we can achieve in space, you would need to bottle human beings for essentially the entire history of modern humanity
right,
in order to get there. It would be like it's like 100,000 years of human
yeah,
life to get there,
yeah,
and you would have to have like thousands of you'd have to have families live, procreate, give birth, and die
yeah,
multiple like hundreds of times in order
yeah.
to get there. Generations of people would have to live and die on that ship. And I remember for me, that was what that did for me was crystallized for me just how important it is to treat this planet right. Because in my
Yeah.
view, I'm like, we're not going to Proxima Centauri B. That's really far away, and we're
You
not
know, an
quite.
analogy to
Yeah.
that is like a Voyager, one of the Voyager crafts. I mean, it's been traveling since I think it was like 1979, and it's
Hmm.
traveling in excess of 40,000 miles an hour. Now, if that craft was directed towards the Alpha Centauri star system where Proxima B is situated, um, it's been traveling since 79. It's traveling in excess of 40,000 miles an hour. I think 42,000 miles an hour. And in the course of that time, being like what 46 years, we have just crossing one light day, and we're talking about 4.2
Right.
light years.
Right.
So, I
Right.
mean, just like the scope of that, and that's our nearest neighbor. That's the thing that blows my mind. That's our nearest neighbor. So
Yeah.
you think about just the expanse of the galaxy alone, let alone that this is just one galaxy that's just like
Yeah.
situated in sort of an obscure part of the broader universe. And so, when you think about, is there life out there, even if it's just like,
Hmm.
microbial life, I would have to think that like the chances of like this being the sole exception, given the breadth of everything out there and the near infinite nature of what we're looking at here, it's pretty unlikely.
Hmm.
So I mean, we might even find microbial life in the depths of Mars. Who knows?
Hmm.
We're sort of learning all about sort of the nature of what we know to be survivable conditions, and different bacteria that we found in this world has been surviving on different arsenic type foundations. So it's
Hmm.
like how we think about what is necessary for the building blocks of life might not hold true in terms of like when you get to the outer reaches of the solar
Hmm.
system,
Hmm.
or even one of our neighbors being Mars.
Hmm.
But you asked about like kind of, I don't know, an inspirational type
Yeah.
type of thing. I think for me it was 2014. I happened to be up in Svalbard, and which is this archipelago right near the North Pole, and I was filming some documentary, and in the course of that, I got a chance to see the Northern Lights, and it was like
Hmm.
3 o'clock in the morning. I drove out on this tiny little red hatchback with this fixer who had sort of alerted me to it. There's more polar bears than people in this
Hmm.
archipelago. So the whole time I've got my head on a swivel. But
Hmm.
there was just this moment that I looked overhead, and you just see this otherworldly swirl, this like river of emerald green and reds and purples. And that moment, I was thinking like, what people thousands of years ago might have thought when they saw something like that. Like this was before modern astronomy or physics, but there were stories. There were stories that kind of relate what they were seeing in this celestial order to their more human experience. And so you
Hmm.
have like mythologies that come out of this, like frost giants and Nordic heroes like Thor and Loki and
Hmm.
all these other
Hmm.
things that kind of come out of these very otherworldly phenomenon that clearly people in North were seeing, and just, we're sitting around campfires and trying to make sense of it. And I often think about that when I
Hmm.
go camping with my daughter, and we're just, sitting out there in the Arizona deserts in that like low light pollution environment, low humidity, and just, looking up at those stars and just like telling stories. And
Hmm.
fundamentally, I think that's what a lot of us are driven by, whether or not we're engineers or scientists or anything else. Like there are these narratives that capture us and that drive us. And some of us have to go. We don't know why we're going, but like there's always a kid in a hometown high school that's leaving, and they don't know why they're leaving, but they know they have to get the hell out of here.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, you put that in terms of a broader context, and maybe some state funding, maybe some commercial interests, maybe some geopolitical competition behind us, and all of a sudden, like the stars are the limit.
Hmm. The book is Open Space: From Earth to Eternity, The Global Race to Explore and Conquer the Cosmos. David Ariosto, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jake.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.